Hey guys, my name is Rachel and welcome to my channel. So today's video is going to be the fifth and final episode in my Escaped mini-series. Now, this case is honestly one of the saddest cases that I have researched because unlike most of the other escaped cases that we've heard of, this one doesn't really have a happy ending. Honestly, the details in this case are just gonna leave you frustrated and feeling kind of empty. So with all of that being said, today we are going to be talking about the kidnapping and escape of Steven Stayner. Steven Stayner was born April 18th of 1965 to parents Delbert and Kay Stayner in Merced, California. He had 3 sisters and 1 brother, and honestly, they had a relatively normal family life. On December 4th, 1972, 7-year-old Steven was walking on his way home from school. A man later identified as Erwin Murphy approached Steven and said that he was a part of a church and asked him if his mom would be interested in donating to the church. Steven said yes, and the man asked him where he lived so that they could take him home and get the donation from his mother. This is when a white Buick pulled up and Steven hopped right in. The man driving the Buick was 34-year-old convicted rapist Kenneth Parnell. Now, instead of driving Steven to his home, they drove to a cabin in Cathys Valley, California. Erwin Murphy was described as a trusting, simple-minded, naive man who worked with Kevin Parnell at Yosemite National Park. Parnell, who said he was an aspiring minister, convinced Murphy to help him get Steven so that they could take him and raise him in a religious type manner. Now, before I get too much further into this case, just like I do in every other video, I want to get into the background of Kevin Parnell just a little bit. Parnell was born September 26, 1931 in Amarillo, Texas. His family moved to Bakersfield, California, where he was raised mostly by his single mother because his father had actually abandoned him when he was only 6 years old. And when he was 13 years old, he was actually molested by an older man. After this had happened, he took his anger out by setting a fire to a nearby pasture and was arrested for the very first time and placed into juvie. After he was released, he was later arrested again for committing public sex acts. He tried to escape prison, and of course, when he escaped and returned, he attempted suicide. He had many other run-ins with the law and was placed in and out of mental health facilities. In March of 1951, he was charged with sodomizing a young boy and the impersonation of a police officer. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison for this. He later went on to rob a service station at gunpoint in Utah, and he served 5 years in prison for this and then was paroled and was told that he could never come back to Utah. Now, according to Parnell, he had been married 3 times, but there are only actually records of 2 of these marriages. Parnell also had 2 children. So we know that this man did not have a very sound state of mind, and he had a pretty lengthy criminal history. Now, when Steven didn't come home that day, his mother didn't really think much at first. She thought, he was a little boy, he might be out playing with his friends. But when 5 p.m. rolled around and she still hadn't heard from Steven, she began to worry. She called around, tried to figure out what was going on with Steven, and she actually found out that none of Steven's friends had actually seen him or heard from him at all after school. At 5:15 p.m., Steven's mother called the authorities. Now, Steven took the same way home from school every single day. A worker at a local service station had confirmed that he had seen Steven walking home that day. However, there were no actual witnesses who saw him get into the van or saw the man speaking to him. When the police showed up, they searched the entire area and kind of followed the path that Steven took home, but they found nothing. At this point, there wasn't really much they could do, and they honestly weren't even sure what had happened. They didn't know that if he was taken or if he wandered off. There were so many things that could have happened that they just kind of said if he didn't show up that night, that the next day they would do a more intensive search. And of course, little Steven did not show up home that night, so the next day they heavily searched the area. Still, they found nothing. Throughout the months and years that Steven was missing, Steven's mother reached out to the media to try and spread awareness and get his face out there and let people know that they were searching for him. But the media outlets weren't really interested in sharing Steven's story. The very first night that Steven arrived to Parnell's cabin, Parnell molested Steven. He was sexually abused many, many more times after that. Now, what's really sad is that when Steven told Parnell that he wanted to go home, Parnell actually told Steven that he now had custody of him because his parents could no longer afford to raise him with all the kids they had, and they didn't want Steven anymore. Parnell told Steven that his parents weren't looking for him, that they didn't really care that he was gone, that they knew exactly what was happening because, again, they didn't want him. He then renamed Steven to the name Dennis Gregory Parnell. Now, the kind of weird thing about this is that even though he gave him a new first and last name, Gregory was actually Steven's real middle name, so he at least got to keep his middle name, but obviously that's not much of a consolation for what was happening to him. Parnell had passed himself off as Steven's father, and they even moved around multiple different locations in California. As they were moving around, he actually enrolled Steven in different schools. People who knew Steven at school had absolutely no idea what he was going through because they said that Steven just seemed like a completely normal kid. Now, when Parnell was enrolling Steven into these schools, he used his real birthday, but obviously enrolled him under the name Dennis. They put down the real name of Steven's previous school, but they didn't actually have records of these previous schools. An employee actually noticed that they didn't actually have records of Steven going to these previous schools, and she made a note of that, but they never actually followed up on it, and they never actually got these records. Steven also worked different jobs throughout the time that he was being held captive. So really, Steven did have every chance to escape, but he honestly just didn't know what to do. He didn't really know who to go to or who to ask for help. Plus, he was so brainwashed, thinking that his parents didn't want him and that they weren't looking for him and that they couldn't afford him, that he just kind of accepted this as his new reality. Now, when Steven was 9, a woman named Barbara Mathis actually moved in with him and Parnell. Now, apparently, she didn't know that Steven was kidnapped. However, she did participate with Parnell in sexually abusing Steven on 9 separate occasions. Now, as Steven got older, Parnell tried to use Steven to kidnap other young boys, but all of these attempts were unsuccessful. Now, Parnell thought that he just wasn't good at this whole kidnapping thing, but Steven was actually sabotaging these kidnappings every single time. He had also tried to use Barbara to kidnap another young boy, but that attempt was also unsuccessful. How she didn't know that Steven was kidnapped after she herself had tried to help Parnell steal a young boy is just beyond me. However, 7 years later, on February 14th, 1980, Parnell and one of Steven's friends, a teenage boy named Randall Porman, kidnapped a 5-year-old little boy named Timmy White while he was playing in his front yard in Ukiah, California. Now, Porman tried to convince Timmy to just get into Parnell's getaway car, but unlike Steven, Timmy actually said no and tried to go back into his home. But Porman decided to grab Timmy and drag him into the getaway car. Parnell, of course, took Timmy to the same cabin that him and Steven were staying in. He dyed Timmy's blonde hair to dark brown and changed his name to Tommy. Of course, he tried to pass Timmy off as Steven's younger brother. However, Steven did not want to see Timmy go through the same abuse that he had been suffering for the past 7 years. He was extremely protective over Timmy and would not let Parnell touch him or do anything to him. On March 1st, 1980, Parnell went to work at his night security job. This is when Steven decided to leave the cabin and get Timmy out of this situation. Now, Parnell lived in a remote back area, so they had to walk quite a bit before they spotted a truck driver who would pick them up. Now, originally, Steven wanted to return Timmy to his home, but Timmy couldn't really remember his address, and obviously Steven had no idea where he lived. So as they were passing a police station, they actually decided to just get out of the truck and go into the police station. Steven had actually told Timmy to walk into the police station without him. Steven just wanted to drop Timmy off and kind of go off at this point. He didn't really know what he was going to go on to do. He was kind of lost at this point, but he didn't want to go into the police station himself. However, after Timmy ran into the police station, he ran back outside and stood next to Steven, and the two of them just kind of stood there. This is when a police officer saw the two boys and kind of just knew that something was off. He called for another police officer to come over and approach the boys without scaring them away. This officer then detained the both of them. This is when the police found out who Timmy was, but at first, Steven didn't really want to reveal his identity, but eventually he did, and he confessed who he was to the police. Now, police asked Steven what happened to him, and again, Steven was a little bit uncooperative at first because he was just absolutely terrified. Again, he didn't know what to think. He didn't know what to say. He had been with this man for the past 7 years who he thought he was supposed to be with. He thought that his parents wanted nothing to do with him, and again, he just didn't really know what to do. However, police convinced Steven that they would get whoever was responsible for this. So, of course, Steven gave them the name of Steven Stayner. On March 2nd, 1980, police found Parnell and he was arrested on suspicion of abduction. Timmy was returned to his parents, and Timmy and a police officer started their 4-hour journey to return Steven home. Steven was reunited with his family after over 7 years, and Timmy's family was actually so grateful for Steven's courageous act that they mailed him a check for $15,000. When police looked into Parnell, they found his previous sodomy conviction, but Steven told police that Parnell had never actually sexually abused him. In 1981, Parnell was tried and convicted of the kidnapping for Timmy and Steven in 2 separate trials, but he was only actually sentenced to 7 years in prison. He wasn't charged with anything related to sexually abusing Steven. And as if this 7-year conviction wasn't bad enough, he actually only served 5 of these years and was let out on parole. Kenneth Parnell spent less time in jail than Steven spent in captivity at the hands of his kidnapper. Erwin Murphy and Randall Poorman were charged with lesser sentences, but Barbara Mathis was actually charged with nothing. The prosecution actually believed that they were protecting Steven by not charging Parnell with sexual abuse because they wanted to avoid any stigma that would be placed on Steven. They didn't want him to be known as the boy who was sexually molested. Now, this is the part in a lot of other escaped cases where we get to talk about the return home and how they adjusted to life very well, and how despite everything that they went through, they went on to live a normal life. But unfortunately, that was not the case for Steven. Steven's life was not easy after returning home. Now, during his captivity, Parnell let Steven actually basically do whatever. He let him drink and smoke and do all of those different things. However, his parents were not about that, and they had a much more structured household, just like most other families. Steven said that when he returned home, his parents kind of just picked up where they left off. Steven was a teenager at this point, but Steven's parents were actually still treating him like he was a 7-year-old. They treated him as if nothing had changed since the day that he went missing, and they kind of just treated him like he was a little kid. Steven said that nothing was ever the same. He blamed himself for some of the things that had happened to him, and sometimes he even questioned if he should have ever even come home. He said that he wondered why his dad never hugged him anymore, and he just had a pretty overall strained relationship with his father. He did have some brief counseling, but it didn't last long because Steven's father said that he didn't actually need it. He was bullied at school pretty hard for being the kid that was molested, so he actually ended up dropping out and started drinking pretty heavily. Like I said, he had a very strained relationship with his father, and eventually he would be kicked out of his house for his behavior. In 1985, 20-year-old Steven actually married a 17-year-old woman named Jody Edmonston, and they had 2 children together. His life at this point finally started to seem like it was picking itself back up. He spoke to children about personal safety and worked with child abduction groups. Like I said, his life was seeming to get a lot better, but Steven had actually just always blamed himself for his abduction. Sadly, on September 16th, 1989, Steven was riding his motorcycle on his way home from work when he collided with a car and sustained severe head injuries, which led to his death at the age of 24 years old. The car fled the scene, but the driver eventually came forward and was sentenced to 3 months in jail and was fined $100. At his funeral, over 500 people showed up, one of which being Timmy White, who was now 14 years old at the time, and he was a pallbearer. Timmy White actually adjusted to life pretty well after his abduction. He went on to become a police officer and actually spoke with children about safety and the dangers of kidnapping. In 2004, Timmy was summoned to testify against the very man that had taken him years earlier. Unsurprisingly, Kenneth Parnell was being charged with human trafficking after attempting to kidnap a 4-year-old little boy. Porman was also summoned, and the two were actually pretty shocked to see each other because they actually hadn't seen each other since the kidnapping. However, the two actually exchanged some words, they hugged, and Timmy said that he actually forgave Porman for the kidnapping. Kenneth Parnell was once again in prison, and he died on January 21st, 2008 at the age of 76 while in prison. On April 1st, 2010, Timmy White actually died at the age of 35 from a pulmonary embolism, which is basically a blockage in the lungs. On August 28th, 2010, a statue of Timmy and Steven was put up in Applegate Park in Merced, and the residents of Ukiah also put up a statue of Steven and Timmy, which showed them escaping while holding hands. Obviously, this case is extremely sad and doesn't really have a happy ending. Unlike the other cases I covered, Steven didn't really seem motivated to escape his captivity. Like I said, he was told that nobody wanted him, that this man now had custody of him, so he really didn't know what to do. It's honestly really sad what happened to him, and the fact that he just thought that this is life now, this is how it's gonna be, is just incredibly sad. Steven's drive to escape actually came from the other little boy. Steven wanted to protect him. He didn't want this boy to go through the same things that he went through. I didn't find much about Steven's mental state, but we have to assume that Steven was probably extremely depressed, that he blamed himself for the kidnapping after he escaped, So maybe he blamed himself the entire time. We know that a lot of abuse victims feel like they deserve it. So I'm wondering if the entire time that Steven was suffering this abuse, I wonder if he felt like he deserved it and that's why he didn't try to escape. Because again, once there was another little boy in this situation, that's when Steven was motivated to leave. As bad as it is that Timmy had to go through this kidnapping, it was kind of a blessing in disguise, as bad as that is, because I honestly don't know if Steven would have ever tried to escape if Parnell had never went and kidnapped this other little boy. It's absolutely insane that these two men lived very short lives after being kidnapped, while Kenneth got to live into his old age after committing a lifetime of rape and abuse and assault and kidnap and so many other terrible things. Steven and Timmy, while they died from completely unrelated things from the kidnapping, it's so unfortunate, and they died, and the hand that they were dealt in life honestly just doesn't seem fair to me. The justice system in this case just messed up over and over and over again. There really was no justice for this man because he proved to be the type of person who would go to jail for a crime and then be released and commit a heinous crime again and again and again. So it just is beyond me how this man kept getting short prison sentences and then kept being released after he proved that he did not deserve all of these second and third and fourth and fifth chances. He died in jail, but that is no consolation to the things that he caused to other people. Again, he kept doing these things to little boys. He kept committing these awful crimes, and somehow he just kept being released, and it just doesn't make sense to me. I will never understand why he only got 7 years and then only actually had to serve 5. There have been people who have gone to jail for stealing money or a car or dealing drugs or doing drugs who served a life sentence or who served significantly more time than this man who kept ruining lives, who kept torturing and raping little boys. The justice system in this case is just absolutely beyond me, and my heart goes out to Steven, Timmy, their families, and all of the other victims who were hurt by Kenneth Parnell. Well, that's all I have for this case today. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoyed this mini-series, and please let me know in the comments below if you want to see more mini-series like this on my channel. If you guys did like this video, please make sure to leave me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. I put out new true crime and mystery videos every single week. With that, I hope you guys have a great week, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!